Shabbat Shalom and welcome again to this wonderful circle, this beautiful Shabbat morning. And thank you to Cantor Amy and to Carl and to all of our davening leaders who have made it possible for us to celebrate this beautiful, beautiful Shabbat together this way. I told last night at our religious school Shabbat the old story about the person who had some things to say about the rabbi, and the rabbi gave them the penance of taking a feather pillow and going to the roof, you know the story, cutting open the pillow and shaking it out, and letting the feathers fly everywhere and telling the person to recollect the feathers. You've all heard the story. But the second graders and third graders and fourth graders sitting on the bima hadn't necessarily heard that story. And the thing that seemed to shock them the most, as I was reading their faces as I was telling it, was that anybody would have anything to say about the rabbi. And I thought to myself, we have neglected an area of their Jewish education. Because what is more fundamentally Jewish, and let's face it, what's more fun than dissecting our communal leaders over a Shabbos meal? I am grateful to have spent the last 10 months as a topic of conversation in your homes. I hope it's been fun for you. I know Rabbi Spitz enjoyed 30 years of that particular honor. Jews have been talking about their communal leaders since the beginning. And that's where we're going to begin together this morning, not actually in our Parsha Tazria-METZOra, but in an incident of Metzora, of this scaly, nasty, sticky, smelly skin rash that we spent the morning talking about. This incident comes from later in the Torah in the book of Numbers, and it's the first text on your paper. Moses and Aaron, Miriam and Aaron, were talking about Moses. By the way, I'm watching Succession. The whole show is just two siblings talking about the third sibling in various configurations. So a biblical callback on HBO right now. Moses and Aaron were sitting around, Miriam and Aaron were sitting around talking about brother Moses, and in particular, they had some feelings about Moses' wife. They had some things to say about their sister-in-law. Who among us has not had a thing to say about a sister-in-law or a brother-in-law? There's things to be said. In this particular incident, they are talking about a sort of mysterious woman that we're not sure who she is. It's the only time she's referenced in the Torah, maybe. Moses has married a Cushite woman, an Ethiopian, a black African. Now, the rabbis in the commentaries are very, very divided on whether this Cushite woman is Tzipporah, Moses' original wife, and many of the commentators say that it is, and go in all sorts of interpretive directions explaining how Cushite is just another term for a beautiful woman, and Tzipporah is a beautiful woman, so therefore they're talking about the beautiful woman. Maybe. There is an obscure phrase in Habakkuk, who you didn't even know was a prophet. I never read the book of Habakkuk, and I'm a rabbi. In Habakkuk, in which they use the word Midian and Cush together, and some people say this means that Midian, where Tzipporah was from, used to be called Cush. Maybe. What it looks a whole lot more like in the Pshat, in the simple reading, is that Moses married another woman. This was an era of polygamy, and Moses seems to have taken a Cushite, a black African wife, at some point during his 40 years of leading the people through the desert, as though he didn't have enough to worry about. I always thought polygamy sounded exhausting, right? Oh, God. Two to worry about? She's not here, is she? And don't worry, she doesn't watch. So Miriam and Aaron are talking about Moses' new African wife, and God gets mad at them for talking about Moses. And the cloud of glory, God's presence, leaves as a result of God being offended. God takes God's clouds and goes. And what is left behind but Miriam, Metzorat, with this tzarat skin affliction. I don't use the word leprosy because it's not actually the right translation. It's not the disease that we know as leprosy or Hansen's disease. It is some kind of a spiritual affliction made manifest on the skin. But Miriam's got it as punishment for having talked bad about her sister-in-law and about Moses. Interesting separate question why Aaron doesn't get it too. Good question, different year. I need to have more than one drash. I plan to stay here for a while, so that can come next year. This year, Miriam gets tzarat, and Miriam has to deal with the punishment that comes with tzarat, because tzarat isn't just an affliction for which one needs to be healed. It is a punishment for which one needs to atone, which is a 7-day timeout outside of the camp. She needs to go sit outside of the camp for 7 days before this will clear up and she can come back and be with everybody else. And so the rabbis often connect the idea of lashon hara, of speaking ill of people, with tzaraat, because of this incident of Miriam, who spoke lashon hara about her brother, about her sister-in-law, and was afflicted with tzarat. And so many rabbis have been able, on the Shabbat, when it's very hard to find something to say, to talk about lashon hara, about which there's always a lot to say. I, however, want to point out a particular kind of lashon hara which is being spoken here, which in many years of hearing drashot about this portion is somehow one of those things that I never noticed. What is the specific lashon hara that Miriam and Aaron are speaking about? Racism. It looks a lot like racism. It looks a lot like they have a problem not just with Moses' wife, but about his Cushite wife. And by the way, the term Cushi used in contemporary Hebrew is not a nice way of describing a person of color. Now, we don't know historically, we don't know whether that reflects an accurate historical reading of this text. We don't know if at this point anti-black racism can be projected back 3,000 years or not. But what we do know for sure is that we live in a world with plenty of it. So whether this is historically the truth of 3,000 years ago, or whether it is just the truth of today, it is a topic worth talking about. What is the lashon hara that gets spoken here? The lashon hara is being targeted against the entrance into the family of a person who's a different color than the rest of the people. By the way, they're all brown. But this is somebody who's coming in who's black. The rabbis in the Talmud, when they're discussing the penalty for tzarat, the penalty for getting this spiritual affliction made manifest on the skin, of needing to sit outside of the camp for 7 days, say, why is this necessary? Why is it necessary for people to take a 7-day timeout outside of the camp? Rabbi Shmuel bar Nadav asked Rabbi Hanina, why concerning a Metzora does the Torah state he shall dwell alone, or she shall dwell alone in this case, outside of the camp? Rabbi Hanina replied, because his sin is that he causes separation between husband and wife and between neighbor and neighbor, and therefore he shall dwell alone. The penalty for this kind of talk which divides the world into us and them, this kind of talk which makes some of us other and some of us lesser, the penalty for that is that you need to physically manifest the separation that you are putting out into the world in yourself. We are dividing one person from another, and therefore, measure for measure, midah keneged midah, we are to be divided from the camp. We are to pull away and sit alone as we try to make others feel alone. There is a way in which the prejudices that we all carry, and none of us are immune to them, it is the water in which we swim, it is the air in which we breathe. There is none of us who have not imbibed in the course of our lives a variety of prejudices, a variety of preconceived notions, a variety of ways of seeing others as different fundamentally than ourselves. There is a way in which living in that space and seeing the world with those eyes does physically make us separate from one another, moves us out to our own island, separate from the extraordinary people who surround us, who we can't see ourselves in kinship with, in which the prejudice we point toward others winds up leaving us profoundly alone, denying us the life-giving connection that we might otherwise have found if we were able to look the centimeter below the skin. But unfortunately, hatred also has a way of binding us together, doesn't it? Groups form around hatreds, around looking at the other and defining them as another. It's a way of sometimes creating bonds together. The truth is that the biblical model, at least as interpreted by the rabbis, that said, if you look with eyes of prejudice, you will be isolated and alienated, isn't actually true. Rather, sometimes the opposite is true. If you look with eyes of prejudice and discrimination, you will very easily find your own tribe that's very happy to join with you in that. Thank the internet for that particular contribution, though it certainly predates that. It is actually more the case that rather than isolating ourselves when we see people as other, that we are inflicting a sickness, a pain on others. And that spiritual pain of being made different, that spiritual pain of being seen as lesser, that spiritual pain of being reduced from your full humanity, just like Tzaraat, translates into physical manifestation. I watched this week a TED Talk by Dr. David R. Williams, a leading professor of public health at Harvard Medical School, who gave a TED Talk with many millions of views called How Racism Makes Us Sick, in which he demonstrates from vast amounts of public health data that those who live with ongoing discrimination, those who live at the short end of society's stick, experience that hatred not just in their minds but in their bodies. Research has found that higher levels of discrimination are associated with elevated risk of a broad range of diseases, says this public health professor, from blood pressure to obesity to breast cancer to heart disease, and even to premature mortality. Strikingly, some of the effects are observed at a very young age. For example, in a study of black teenagers, found that those who reported higher level of discrimination as teenagers had higher levels of stress hormones, higher blood pressure, and higher weight already by age 20. That the spiritual pain of being made other can turn into physical manifestation, raises your cortisol, raises your blood pressure, raises even the potential of your mortality. This is the closest correlation. As I was watching this, and I'm talking about it with the cantors, we were discussing the Shabbat. This is the closest manifestation I've ever seen to what we're talking about in this parsha. In this parsha, we're talking about the ways in which spiritual malady manifests in our bodies. And this professor is saying that's not just for Torah. That is a truth of the world. That the hatred that can be turned against us, the ways that we can be made other, the ways that we can be made invisible, can have an impact on our health and even on our lives. So what do we do about this? What do we do about the sickness in the soul, which manifests in fun ways over Shabbat lunch, dissecting the clergy, and manifests in profoundly terrible ways in discrimination which can cost people their health or their lives. Well, today we're sitting in a circle. We're sitting in a circle because that helps to make the music better, and we're sitting in a circle because it's important to get out of our comfort zone and our usual seat, and we're sitting in a circle because there is something spiritually important when we look each other in the eye. There is something spiritually important about seeing one another and seeing one another deeply. There is an antidote to the kind of alienation and isolation that we read about in this week's Parsha. And our task, our profoundly important task as a people who has known and does know profound discrimination, profound hatred, and profound othering in the world, as a people who has experienced this kind of thing that we are talking about for thousands upon thousands of years, our task is to figure out how to keep making the circle bigger. Our task is to figure out how to see each other in the way that we are doing today, and how to keep adding rows and keep adding rows, to keep adding more and more different kinds of people until we recognize that there aren't different kinds of people, there are only people. As we build out our circle, as we see one another, as we address the malady that can live in our souls that divides us one from the other, we create a world of more holiness and of more possibility. This month, I learned from our cantor, in the Hasidic world, this month, ER, is understood to be a Rosh Teva, is understood to be an acronym. ER, Aleph, Yud, Yud, Resh, Ani Adonai Rofecha. I am God, your healer. This is understood to be a month of healing. May it be a time in which we consciously seek to walk in the world with an orientation toward healing some of the divisions which threaten the stability of our society and the health of our bodies, in which we look each other in the eye and draw closer to each other, in which we notice those who are outside of the camp and invite them back home. Shabbat Shalom.